So we have our speakers up here. We're just going to go ahead and as you have questions, you're going to say them when we call on you. And then I'll repeat the question here just so we have it on the record on there. And then they're going to answer it. And this is going to be pretty free discussion, so even if one of you wants to jump in, even though it was directed to the other one or something like that, we can do that. That's fine. And I've got some questions too that I've been thinking about. So if we get stuck, we can always throw that in. But I want to go ahead and open it up. If you've got a question, just go ahead, raise your hand, and then we'll kind of go from there. Oh, now I can see nothing. Nope. Okay. So who's got a question? Well, good night. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Right, yeah, correct. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to discuss that anymore? So just so everybody heard that, so we're talking about how an organism switches from non-parasitic to parasitic,
Right, yeah.
latches on there. How is it that then gets passed on to offspring, essentially?
Yeah, so I told you a simplistic story where you have, a sea anemone who realizes that there's food underneath his feet and he starts eating it. Right, that's not really what's happening. It's much more complicated, and yeah, genes are going to have to come into play there. So I think what we remember is that there's going to be variation in that sea anemone population, and some are going to be more filter feeding than others, and so within that variation over time, natural selection can draw forth some really interesting behaviors and morphologies simply out of that random variation intrinsic in that population. And so if there's, Dr. Engel mentioned directional selection, so if there's really only one direction to go, then I think selection can pull it pretty quickly into that direction. But I don't know specific, I can't tell you specific genes or details beyond that.
Yeah, I think if you have a very dynamic feeding strategy possible, right? So you have individuals you'd have individuals that feed, by filter feeding exclusively. You'd have some individuals that are combination of filter feeding and pulling, materials from where it is, and then you have some individuals that are even just pulling materials from down beneath it. And then I think what you get there is maybe even disruptive selection, in which you start to move towards the two extremes, right? You start to move from a generalist diet to a more specialized diet, which I think is fairly common as you kind of partition up a niche, to become more specialized and less of a generalist. And so you start with a very plastic or a very dynamic feeding strategy that then over time becomes more specialized in two different ways. But yeah, I think initially you'd have to have both feeding strategies present behaviorally, and that behavior would need to be partially determined by the organism's genetics, or at least epigenetics, so that it's heritable behavioral differences.
And here's maybe a better way to think about it, other than the tentacles turning over. So the petal disc and the oral disc actually have a lot of the similar functions and cells. So the glands on the petal disc, you could have variation in the population of sea anemones where some in absorptive capabilities of the petal disc. So you have glands on the attaching part that start absorbing nutrients from the place they're attaching in a variation in the population. And the ones that are better at absorbing nutrients from their substrates do better over time than those who can't do that. And so that would be a maybe more specific route. Instead of turning the tentacles down, you're basically turning the petal disc into tentacles and burrowing in over time. And then you're all the way inside eventually.
Okay. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to bring the microphone over here. We'll try that instead.
Is it fair to say that that's an example of loss of genetic information, and how much does loss of genetic information play in parasitism in general? Because I don't have a problem with that as a creationist, but like if a parasite develops some new innovative molecular machine, that would be a problem. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think what you're looking at is primarily maybe Nathaniel Jensen's idea of heterozygous fractionation, right? So you have more genetic diversity to begin with, as individuals have multiple different versions of the same gene. And as they start to specialize, you're always going to lose the genetic diversity, right? You're going to lose as you move in either direction, or you move disruptive in both directions away from the middle, the mean condition. You're going to lose variation. And so initially you'd have one population with a great deal of variation in feeding strategies, and then over time you end up with two populations that have very little variation, two completely different strategies, and then now they become behaviorally isolated because they have different diets, and then become reproductively isolated, and I think you set in then those genetic differences. But yeah, I think it almost always comes with a loss of genetic variation. You can maintain some of that genetic variation, but it's difficult. The selection almost always comes with a loss of genetic variation. And you would need some mechanism other than natural selection to get some kind of a new machine, a new strategy even. Natural selection can only refine on what's already there. So you would need some other mechanism to introduce that. And I think that's what Todd Wood's idea of altruistic genetic elements provides, a source of variation that can and is capable of adding an enormous amount of genetic material simultaneously, essentially. Because Michael Behe's idea of irreducible complexity demonstrates natural selection's inability to produce structures that are going to require multiple parts, because every single part would need to have a significant fitness advantage to the individuals with it, which seems unlikely, especially since even if you get like the entire part all at once, you're talking about a fitness advantage that even with that, it would take natural selection generation upon generation to fix it. Natural selection is very slow. And again, almost always leads to loss of genetic variation.
I do want to add on to that. That's a great answer. I agree with all that. I think with some parasites, like the Saccharina parasite, that's just the kidney bean and the spaghetti. That's the classic example of a degenerative parasitism. It's actually a barnacle, which has a shell and legs and complex internal morphology, and then over time, all those atrophy, all those go away. It's loss. So I think some parasites definitely degenerate like that. But I also have to admit that there are some parasites that do have really complex, novel morphologies and behaviors. And this is all the way back to those fathers of parasitology. They used parasites as evidence of God's design, the same way Behe would, the same way I would. And so I do think it's possible for there to be. And I think there's room within young Earth creationism for some disagreement about this as we investigate this. But I think with these altruistic genetic elements, you could get new genes being input in there that then natural selection can work on. You can maybe get a new Plasmodium, the malaria parasite, has a really remarkable digestive enzyme that secretes from glands on the front of it, and it just burrows right into the blood cell. It's really, it seems irreducibly complex. It seems designed to do that. So not all parasites are degenerative, and also it can kind of help us appreciate their design elements to them too.
Okay, another question? Let me stand up so I can see. Here, while we're waiting, I have a question, okay? So we talked, so I'm talking to Dr. Engel right now, but you can jump in. So you talked a lot about different examples of roundworms that we thought were parasitic, but actually may have a commensal or mutualistic benefit to us. So what about tapeworms? Are there any examples of tapeworms providing some kind of benefit to the host?
I don't know of I've not seen anybody argue for a mutualistic relationship with tapeworms. I've seen many people argue for a commensal relationship with tapeworms, that the tapeworm, its presence does not actually have a noticeable fitness cost to the host. So much so that several parasitologists have intentionally infected themselves with tapeworms to demonstrate how safe it is to have a tapeworm and to take care of it and care for it, and that's in the first talk I mentioned, it's less interesting when you swallow a camera if you're just using the antigen from the parasite, not the parasite itself.
It's a barren desert,
Yeah, it
devoid
is
of
barren.
life. You want to see some good stuff in there.
Absolutely. But there are parasitologists that have given themselves tapeworms and then swallowed cameras that would take video and still images of the tapeworm in situ.
Scientists are unique people.
No doubt. But tapeworms tapeworms are really interesting that whether you have one tapeworm or 3 individuals in your intestines, you almost always have the same total mass of tapeworm. They seem to regulate, either they regulate their growth or
Your immune system.
or your immune system actually regulates the growth so that you have the same total amount of tapeworm regardless of how many individuals that you have, which is spectacular and helps to keep you alive. And very few, so there are hundreds of tapeworm species that infect humans, but many of them have no actual pathology. The big one, the textbook one that they always associate with tapeworm infections is a vitamin B12 deficiency, which can then lead to anemia and subsequent pathologies. But you would have to have a diet that was completely devoid of all vitamins in order to actually have a noticeable issue, unless you have other
Then you'd have
malabsorption
other
or
problems anyway.
You'd have other problems
Yeah.
as well. Yeah. So.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that some tapeworms are, a centimeter long. Taenia saginata, the human beef tapeworm, can be up to 30 feet long. So you need a lot of those centimeter long tapeworms to get the same mass as that 30-foot long one in your intestines. But yeah, I don't know of any mutualists among the tapeworms.
But the really bad pathology with tapeworms is when humans become self-infected with the larvae of the tapeworm. That's like the pork tapeworm,
oh yeah.
Taenia solium, where we become infected with.
And
the larval
we're not the
stages.
right host.
Right.
So it wants to be in a pig,
Yeah.
and that goes to our
So,
brains.
when you're thinking about original created purpose with tapeworms, and obviously, like you guys were saying, I mean, it could be they've always been commensal, and that's fine. Like, it's not necessarily needs to benefit, right, the host. Is it also entirely possible, thinking through it, that it could be that tapeworms either did have a more mutualistic, thing at first, and they look degenerative, right, in a lot of ways, although they have some specialized features. Or also, as you talked about, I think it was you, Matt, that mentioned, we only investigate things that hurt humans and domestic livestock, right? So, I mean, we could be having tons of tapeworms and other animals that we don't even know what they're up to.
Yeah,
And-
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think and this is what I tell my parasitology class almost every time we meet. I don't know if, some of them are still here. We have, the reality is we have so many organisms that we know almost nothing about. Well, we have parasite species that have been found in one, host ever. Like, there's one documented case of it. But then we have some that they're extremely common. Their prevalence is, 100%, and we still know very little about it because they're not economically valuable and they don't really cause human health issues. So we just don't invest the funds. But, doing research on parasites is extremely inexpensive. And, you have your own body as like a laboratory. You don't even need a lab. It's very inexpensive. All we need are people.
Yeah.
To do that work. So I tell my parasitology class that it's got to be them because I'm too old.
Right. So this was really the point of the Q&A, is to ask for volunteers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we got any other questions while we're waiting? Okay. Oh, right here.
What did you mean that endosymbionts are space fillers?
Yeah, is you have an environment that something can live in, and so even if God did not design something specifically for that environment, you have an environment that can be filled. And so you have, and we have this also, I think about it as analogous to a world following a global flood, is you have all of these environments that need to be filled, and there are animals that spread out to fill them. And then I think, again, if we think about living organisms as environments of themselves, I think we're just beginning to think about creation in the way we ought to. And so you have an environment that can be filled, and something's going to fill it. Whether God created something to fill it or he didn't create something to fill it, something will fill it. If you have a niche that's open, something's going to use it, which is, I think, a lot of the issues that we have when these endosymbionts that were created to be here end up here because there's nothing there. And so they move into there. And then, yeah, I think one of the things that comes up along with that and deals with some of these groups like Neodermata, where you have an enormous amount of diversity. And a lot of it is at, even the genus level. Like some of our genera have hundreds and even thousands of species. And it seems very unlikely that those are separate created kinds, and yet we're well over the 1,500, threshold.
Arbitrary threshold.
The arbitrary threshold, but still. It calls into question, like, how do you get that kind of diversity? And I think if you look at it as though, it was a single created kind, but it was placed into a variety of different spaces that needed to be filled, right? That God filled with this organism, that as the relationships break down following the curse, and as you start to lose some of that connectedness, you basically have the same created kind immediately in hundreds, if not thousands, of unique isolated environments. And you have very quickly something that can lead to rapid and massive diversification.
I think that's a brilliant idea. That's my 2 cents. But yeah, 1,000 tapeworms and 1,000 species, that's 1,000 islands that will each undergo their own unique diversification, and you get 1,000 species.
So it's like a special kind of allopatric speciation, essentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, allopatric speciation. Geographic isolation followed by reproductive isolation.
Okay, question over here. I'm bringing the microphone.
So my question looks back to biology professor back in the day, Dr. Howe, and he told me, long after retirement, he told me all kinds of things about lichens. Now, lichens are symbiotic. So kind of dragnet question. Examples of pathologies in that flavor, the what is it? It's fungus and algae, or
cyanobacteria.
Oh yeah, and how do you think there are situations? I think of the really extreme environments. You get the bugs that live in the volcanic water or under the ocean. You think some of this pathology comes from guys getting out of those really extreme environments? So whatever you have to say. Any comment, one or both of you?
So, yeah, as so I'm a little confused by, are you asking, are there lichens that are having something other than a mutualistic relationship in which that partnership starts to break down, and then you had a secondary question, it seems, where are there examples where some of these organisms created for extreme environments have ended up in less extreme environments that. Yeah, so I'll start with the extreme environments. So those organisms, one of the reasons why we don't find them in less extreme environments is just they get out-competed. It's not that they can't live there. So I mean, if they can live in temperatures of 95 degrees in some of these hot, pools in Yosemite and inward Yellowstone, it's not that they can't live when it's 65 degrees. I mean, their DNA polymerase works really well at 95 degrees, which is why we use it to, make massive copies of DNA in a short period of time. But they could do well in lower temperatures. They just get out-competed by organisms that are better. That they it
makes me feel a little sad for them.
Yeah, but
gotta go live in the salt lake in the heat because.
So I think I would not be surprised to find examples of like extremophiles that end up in places that are less extreme and end up feeding on a host. I don't know of any right off the bat.
Off the top of my head, but
I would say,
sure.
Hydrothermal vents would be a great place to do some of that work to see if you have some of those extremophiles that, especially our chemiosmotic and our, basically taking inorganic materials and fixing the carbon from them and some of the other things. No, that won't be cheap. No, but I would guess that would be the place to look to see if some of those have moved into a facultative parasitic lifestyle. As far as lichens, I'm almost certain that there are parasitic lichens, and there are
Yeah,
lichens.
I think basically any time you have a relationship, you're going to see a spectrum from mutualism to parasitism. Any type of close relationship.
Yeah, but like they'll eject. I mean, they'll punish partners. Same thing. Like so, plants have the fungus that live in their roots, and they kind of have a deterioration in some of those too, where the plants will eject the fungi, or the fungi will stop feeding the plants, and you have all kinds of little battles that come up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
So I'm going to interject a question here for Jeremy. So your students looked at 4 phyla. What do you think about the other phyla? I mean, I'm not expecting there to be like certain phyla. I don't think we're going to see much of anything. But
Right.
would there be other ones that would be potential, could contribute in a big way to the results of that?
Yeah, I mean the insects spectacularly, right? All the parasitoid insects. There's 1 million species of insects, and half of them are parasitoids. So I think the definition of parasite is really going to matter. So under the strict definition that we used, all those parasitoids aren't parasites because they have a free living stage of their life cycle. So I mean I think they're still parasites, but again the definition matters. So I've seen ecologists argue that actually just about every life form is parasitic. Herbivory is parasitic, right? You're eating the tree. You're not killing it. You're just hurting it in little ways. So it's often how you're framing the question. But yeah, I'd love to look more into the insects. Obviously, I was a little disappointed my students wanted to look at
regardless, you would have
jellyfish.
gone and looked at
Yeah. But it's just such a massive problem. A massive 1 million species is a lot.
Yeah, hard to get started on that. Okay. Yes, we've got a question back here. I'm going to bring the mic.
I noticed in your guys' talks today, you avoided the term microevolution in explaining the diversity problem. Is there a reason why you would not use that term, or is that an appropriate term to use in explaining the diversity problem?
I didn't use that term because I didn't. It wasn't like a deliberate attempt to avoid using a term. I did give a talk once in which I used the term microevolution and somebody got mad, but that's pretty rare. I just didn't use the term, but yeah, I think microevolution is a perfectly satisfactory term to use as you're changing allele frequencies. I think maybe the reason I didn't use it is because I was talking about specific mechanisms of microevolution, genetic drift, natural selection, mutations, so talking about specific examples rather than it as a general idea.
Yeah, I think the terms micro and macroevolution, they make a lot of intuitive sense. Micro is small, macro is big, and so for the average person, it makes a whole lot of sense to distinguish between micro and macro. But as a biological term, the definition of microevolution is change in allele frequency over time. So you're talking about change within a species. And so when an evolutionary biologist hears creationists talking about microevolution, they have this definition in mind where you're talking about change, population change. And so anything larger than change within between genera, which most young creationists would include different genera within baramins, that's technically macroevolution. So the cat baramin, that's technically macroevolution according to the biological definitions of those terms. So I tend to not use those terms at all because it's confusing because lay people and scientists use them differently, and I would rather just be more precise when I'm talking about, if I'm talking about population change, I'll say population change. When I'm talking about change within kinds, I'll say that. So I didn't intentionally not say that, but I would also intentionally not say that.
I think there's a lot of parallels there with when we're talking about created kind studies and we talk about species. And,
Yeah.
So many people have this idea of species as like a type of animal that's like set, and when they hear people talk about speciation or species changing, it makes them think automatically about, Darwin's Tree of Life, and it's
Right,
like those
yeah.
are not the same thing.
Yeah, I
We're
loved
talking
what Matt said about
yeah,
that.
when you're talking about
Yeah.
baraminology, right, in that orchard, that yeah, we can have a scientific definition of species is not the same thing as a biblical kind.
Right,
So
yes,
yeah, it's confusing, I think,
Yeah.
sometimes for lay people.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
confusing for scientists too. But,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's why within 10 years of the publication of The Origin of Species, I mean, pretty much everybody was on board. I mean, at least in Europe.
Because they finally had something to explain not essentialism,
Yeah.
which seemed so clearly wrong, but didn't have anything else.
Okay. Other questions? I mean, I could sit up here and talk about essentialism. Okay. Carrie.
So I was just wondering, when it comes to like the fossil record, if there are like ancient examples of parasites, and then how that kind of bleeds into the question of redemption for them, and like that question of what they were designed for, if that makes sense.
So the answer is yes. There are lots of examples of paleoparasitism. It is beyond my area. I have done very, very little work in paleoparasitism, but there are examples. And many of the examples are not for an actual parasite individual, but something morphologically wrong with something larger that is similar to what happens with a current parasitic infection. So it's an inferred parasitism, but I'm sure there are also fossilized forms of parasites, especially in his area with the parasitic insects. You know, we have fossil mosquitoes for sure, and we have fossil mosquitoes that were no doubtedly eating and feeding on blood. And so I think what it does in terms of the redemption aspect, I would say, well, I say it does two things. One is it demonstrates that the curse is actually and the curse and what we see from it is present throughout most of our deposits, right? I mean, as we look at the fossil record, we see evidence of the curse, which is an indication that all of these deposits came following the fall. And I think the best explanation is they were laid down during a global flood, and so you have that. But I think what it also does is it shows us how quickly things went awry, and how hard the work of redemption is in some of these groups, like these ichneumoniid wasps. I don't know if redemption is even possible. You'd have to. I mean, I'll give him that one. That's just a group that. It's really, really difficult to think about what were they designed to do. A lot of this came up when I did the paper on, or the article on blood feeding animals for Answers magazine, is, you know, trying to figure out, okay, well, what did they do? I mean, what were they created to do? And I think the best explanation isn't from me, is actually, and it's not from a creationist at all, it's from a secular scientist, and said that they must have eaten plant materials that were really high in iron and other heavy metals. There are lots of plant tissues that are really rich in iron and other heavy metals, and so they already had the mechanisms for digesting that. And then you have a food source, and if you've got a space, something's going to fill it, right? You've got a niche, you've got something to eat, something's going to eat it. If it's just a matter of, can you eat it and make it work? And if you have the ability to metabolize these heavy metals, the answer is yes. You have the ability to eat it and make it work.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is that the evolution into parasitism is a question that we can look to our secular colleagues and find some common ground with. So tapeworms evolved from something. The first organism wasn't a tapeworm. So we can talk to our atheist friends and colleagues about the evolution of parasites and come up with some really interesting ideas. There's this really good book on parasites called Parasite Rex by Carl Zimmer. He's an atheist, but he's a really good science writer. And I don't remember the details. I wish I did, because I don't know anything about paleontology. But he talks in that book. I think I could be misremembering the details, but the origin of tapeworms is hypothesized to be in fish, and then pteranodons actually get tapeworms and transfer them to the terrestrial environment. I think that I could be misremembering the details, but I think that's kind of the current hypothesis. But a lot of these questions we share with our atheist colleagues, and so there could be some really interesting collaborations there.
Yeah, I mean, I can, as a paleontologist, I can say that there are fossil parasites. I mean, what Dr. Engel was saying about usually not seeing the body preserved really works for the endoparasites, right? We do have lots of ectoparasite fossils, though, ticks and fleas and mosquitoes.
Plenty of
it. There's even there's one that was published recently. They found a piece of amber, and inside was a feather, and there was a tick hanging onto the end of it, just by one leg. And the tick was engorged. And so the whole paper was just on the taxonomy of the tick. And I'm like, no one wanted to drill into this thing. I mean, like,
Get some
it's got
DNA.
blood, and get some DNA out of it. I don't know why no one. I don't know. It wasn't even like brought up in the paper. I thought that was really weird. But that's what everyone wanted to know. You know, not that
Jurassic Park with ticks.
Yeah. But so yeah, I mean, there is definitely some stuff there. But yeah, I love what you brought up about the fossil record. That just the you can't on the one hand say, oh yeah, this is horrible, this is terrible that we have these disease-causing organisms, and then say, oh, but I think the fossil record is before Adam. It's like, well,
right.
Hold on, like you can't do both those things. Like you see the same kinds of diseases and parasitic things in the fossil record as well. And so that's a good point. I think we had a question over here.
So I was just wondering, as there was no death before the fall, that would also imply that humans would not have died. So if there had been no fall, would this mean that humans would have at some point just stopped reproducing? Also, likewise regarding animals or something, or how is that to be understood?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, so John Calvin has a really interesting idea about that I think Augustine, he sourced in Augustine, but I think so I'm just going to rely on them rather than myself. I think they kind of envisioned God's original plan for Adam and Eve, and the Garden of Eden was this place of soul making, of maturing into the likeness of God. And once that maturation was complete, that sanctification was complete, they would basically go to be with God. So like Enoch taken up from the earth to be with God. And so John Calvin just says, I think it's in his commentary on Genesis, that if they hadn't sinned, they would have just continued, and then they would have been transformed into the imperishable, the perishable, that's Paul. But the idea was they would be taken up, and so you don't get the same kind of population growth problem, because you have humans filling the earth and then maturing and being taken up to heaven with God, which I think is an interesting idea.
Well, and that Jesus responds to the question from the Sadducees, when they come to him and they're challenging him with ideas of the afterlife, and they said, okay, well, so, a man has a wife, doesn't have any offspring, so then his brother marries her, and then they're challenging him like, well, whose wife is she going to be in the afterlife? And he says, you don't know anything about what you're talking about. He said, there is no marriage, like you're not given in marriage, you're not. So I think this is probably shaping Calvin's ideas as well, that once, marriage was created for two purposes. One was to multiply and fill the earth, and the other one was to be a representation of the relationship within the Godhead. And, and that's why you need male and female to be
Diversity
the image
and
of God.
harmony.
Male and female, he created them. And so when that purpose is complete, then you enter into a different kind of nature in which you are no longer multiplying and filling the earth. The animals, that one I think is maybe less complicated theologically, because it doesn't seem that animals are created with the same nature that humans are. God breathes life into them like he does humans, but they are not made in the image of God. And so I think they probably would have regulated their own reproductive output to avoid that situation. I mean, vertebrates do that now. Vertebrates will regulate the reproductive output to not put themselves in a situation in which they won't have enough resources to care for their offspring. And so they do that already. I don't think there's any reason to suspect why they wouldn't have done that, and why they won't do that in the new creation, the new heavens and the new earth. Why they wouldn't do that then, regulate their reproductive output to not overfill.
One thing I thought about that is that I think you lose something of value if the world is filled and reproduction stops. You lose new life. You lose babies. You lose all the goodness of growing, maturing, curiosity, playfulness. So fill it, but a world with just adults seems really boring, and God's not boring. So I think that's a good possibility, but I don't know. I mean,
Do you want to have those baby red pandas?
yeah, because they're adorable, right? And even baby crickets. Have you ever seen a little baby cricket?
Well, I think you run into the same issue once again when you think about, as you're talking about the new heavens and new earth, okay, I mean, what do we do?
Yeah.
How does
Yeah.
that work? And of course, we know, as you said, God is not boring. I don't think we're ever going to have to worry about being bored.
Right.
But I think it comes back to, just to kind of springboard off what you guys are saying, it's that flatland principle, right? Of, if
can't
you're a
imagine.
square, you can't imagine a three-dimensional world. And I would think, I suspect very much is the case for the past and the future, right? There's a certain sense where we can't understand part of it, but there are certain things that are just so alien to the way we think that I just think it's not even going to occur to us what it means, And even when you talk about, we brought up Paul a minute ago with perishable and imperishable, right? And Paul talks about what will the new body be like, right? And he's like, well, it's like, you put in a seed and out pops a tree, right? I mean, you're not going to look at that seed unless you know ahead of time and think, oh yeah, a tree's going to come out of it.
Right.
That's never
Yeah,
going to occur to you. Yet there is a
exactly.
relationship between the two,
Yeah,
right? There's
yeah.
something there that still tethers it, but on the other hand, it's just going to be so incredibly different. It's hard to really say.
Yeah,
would be my guess.
Yeah.
Any other
Who can say?
questions? Oh, over here. Let me run it over.
Well, I don't really have anything to contribute to parasitology, but you began talking about these boundary crossing questions where faith and science can
Yeah.
relate. I'd like to suggest that one discipline where that's common is geology. If the geological processes on Earth occupied a few thousand years instead of 500 million years, that's a radically different situation. The processes are likely to be very different. And in my experience and with my friends, in geology, these boundary crossing questions are everywhere. Things where our understanding of Earth history can suggest hypotheses, totally different mechanism. It's
Yeah.
just very practical things. They're everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. And I've been inspired by your research. I've been inspired by Kurt Wise and Todd Wood and the good geology work that you guys have done. You guys showed me when I was a student that you can be a Christian and you can be a scientist and you can work on these boundary crossing questions and come up with some really interesting ideas. So thank you for the inspiration. And I also think it's really awesome that you're a geologist, so you see all this stuff in geology. It's full of boundary crossing questions. I can come up with a few in geology, but in biology, I think biology is full of these boundary crossing questions. It's just boundary crossing questions because I can't separate my biology from my faith. Neither can you separate your geology from your faith. I think that's wonderful.
It is interesting to note that geologists abandoned a young Earth before biologists did.
Yeah.
So.
Shame on you.
In our
But
defense,
I think it's because of those boundary, the boundary crossing questions, and you're like, well, if this is the rate of sedimentation, like,
It's pretty easy math. Yeah.
for sure.
I think this even comes back to one of the things you brought up about the pteranodon eating the fish and getting tapeworm, right? Like they are limited based on, okay, well, we know where tapeworms, or we have an idea of where they might first show up.
Right, right.
Maybe doing like a clock or something like that. Okay, that puts you in Cretaceous. Okay, you got pteranodon.
You got to get into reptiles somehow.
In our model, I mean, you've got birds alive then. You've got, I mean, they do too, but different birds, seabirds and things. You've got humans alive then. So like, yeah, you could easily get tapeworms, a different route like that. And so it does, those boundary crossing questions really do come in all the time. Absolutely. Any other questions? This has been good. Okay, right over there.
These have sort of a theological overtone, but looking back at the fall, you mentioned the love of God that would create all this beauty and diversity, but you didn't mention the justice of God. And I wonder if some of the curse is actually punishment of what we're seeing today, considering that the Genesis record mentions pain in childbirth and thorns as two examples. So for a human race that has gone toward Satan and abandoned the kingdom of God, why not? Why wouldn't God send some pain and suffering? We're all going to die anyway, right? Eventually, that's the ultimate punishment.
Consequence, yeah.
And maybe a related question, speculative, is do you think that Satan has any ability for genetic engineering? You know, he's not creating the genome, but I wonder if humans can do that, if maybe in God's permissive will, he could tweak some things to make them painful.
Malevolent.
Like
yeah,
with
well,
Job.
we know that you see in the account of the plagues in Egypt, right, that the demons had the capability of forming and filling creation as well. Like, they couldn't create out of nothing like God can, but they seem to be able to form and reform creation for their will. And so I would imagine Satan is capable of doing so as well, that he has some control.
Are you talking about with the magicians?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was
Interesting.
just, I was just
I've-
clarifying. I wasn't sure what you meant.
Yeah, I've never interpreted it that way, but don't necessarily have a problem with that. I've always interpreted that more not satanic as tricks
Tricks and, yeah,
tricks
for sure.
and stuff. But yeah,
Sleight of hand.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
sleight of hand.
Maybe
yeah,
some
it-
wicked science.
Sure. It wouldn't. Yeah, it wouldn't shock me. As far as God's judgment, I think you're absolutely right. I think some of these, in the specific ways in which the creation was cursed and is cursed, that a lot of it is God's judgment, and some of the reasons why it's really hard to redeem some of these groups is because of the lasting effects of the curse and the continued judgment until God recreates.
Yeah, I think a lot of the early natural theologians would look at lice and mosquitoes and parasites and say exactly that. These God designed these to inflict us so that we would learn patience and perseverance, cleanliness, compassion, sympathy. So yeah, I think that has a long history of thought within Christianity. It does make me a little uncomfortable with animals, though, with animal suffering, and connecting that to the justice of God, to punish completely unrelated life forms for punishing Adam and Eve for their sin makes sense. But Ezekiel talks about this God not condemning the sons for the sins of their fathers, and neither the fathers for their sons. And so having a botfly eat a horse alive. I need to think more about justice. Would that be just for God to inflict that, or you mentioned permissive will? I think would be where I would tend to go with that.
I think there's a lot more we could say about all of that.
Oh sure, yeah.
We can,
and I'm
I
out
don't
of
want
my
to take up
out
all
of
the
my
time,
field.
but
Yeah.
no, there's some very interesting things to talk about there. I want to ask a question. Just as we do have quite a few students in here, probably have students considering science, careers in science. Can you guys just give a quick, throw in your 2 cents? What should a student be thinking about right now if they're considering a career in science, both in terms of jobs, grad school, just overall mentality, anything like that?
I think what you were talking about at lunch would be helpful for the students to hear about your passion is for research, but you felt
Oh
you
yeah.
need to.
Yeah, so I think when I was an undergrad, I really struggled with my faith because of natural evil, and I thought I felt kind of betrayed by my church and my family, who kind of created this world of goodness and beauty that God made. It was all designed and perfect and harmonious. And then when I got to college and studied science, I found there's lots of brutality and evil, and so I felt like there's a disconnect. And so I never thought I was going to be a teacher. I liked the research, but when I was looking in grad school and I was looking into my future, I saw a future where I'd just be off in Africa studying biodiversity of insects, and I would be happy, I'd be fulfilled, but I wouldn't be making an eternal difference in the lives of people and affecting human souls. And so I knew there were students like me, as I was, who loved science and loved Jesus, and felt like the culture was telling them they couldn't do that. And so I felt convicted that I need to not do research full time. I need to be a teacher, and I need to help us together work through these really interesting, important questions. So I would say that if you're a Christian and you want to be a scientist, you can do that and you should do that. And if you're going to do both, you need to do both well. So like I said in my first talk, I think you need to know God first, and so you can recognize beauty in nature. You know what beauty is, and then you need to go and study nature, and so you know what nature is. And so you need to pursue both simultaneously, not one or the other. God first, science second, but yeah, go pursue science. It's wonderful and interesting, and we need more science.
And I think everybody should teach at least a little bit.
Just to get the suffering.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's just to, yeah, I mean, even if it's just that, or if it's just to figure out, like, is this something you can do? And so I encourage, especially people that are studying science, man, we need good science teachers at the high school and junior high and even elementary level. And, you know, I think having a passion for science and just a love of people, I mean, it makes a great combination. It's hard. I mean, even if you're a really good teacher, it's still hard. It's a really hard job. It's really fulfilling. But yeah, so I think everybody, I think it's like a rite of passage. You know, you got to teach a year, and I think you got to do it with very little help too. You know, just
do it on your own. Oh no, we can
no,
help
we
them out.
Yeah,
we can help them out a little bit.
I don't believe that to be true. I think we need to help our.
Nobody helped us out. We just got dumped and said, you know, go teach. So I'd like to help you out.
Are there any questions? Okay, over here.
Hi, sorry, I have another question. This is about like the idea of redemption, that whole thing. I was wondering what the scope of that redemption is. Like, for example, I'm thinking about foxes who weren't made by God to live in urban areas and yet have adapted to them. Do they need to then be redeemed back to a more natural state? Or, so yeah, just where is that like line, that scope?
It's a great question.
Yeah, this is a big question that comes up in conservation all the time, is what are we trying to get it back to? You know, are we trying to get it back to?
Should we?
Yeah, should we at
get
all?
It
are
back
we
to
anything? Yeah, but this is a big one that comes up. Like, what is our goal? Is our goal like pre-European settlement? Is our goal like pre-industrial revolution? What is our goal? And I think all of those questions often miss the mark and neglect to remember that ecosystems are dynamic. By nature, they are dynamic. And this is where was it Aquinas that you were talking about, that says by nature they have to be mutable, they have to be dynamic, and they can either be augmented or they can be diminished.
It was Augustine, but Aquinas said it too.
Oh, Augustine.
But,
yeah. Well, so
Aquinas said everything Augustine
yeah,
said.
That's
so.
true. Just later.
Yeah.
I think going to scripture and seeing what is the new heaven and the new earth like is helpful in this, right? It's a garden city, right? It's this place where you can live and feel safe, and yet you interact with creation. And so I for one, I mean, animals that are adapted for urban areas, I don't think they need to be, like, redeeming them is not trying to eliminate that. I think there's something actually really beautiful about that, and that's how we got dogs, is wolves basically were adapted for urban environments, and they
So
probably
you're saying
tamed
that there's
themselves.
hope that we can tame raccoons as pets.
Oh, have you never set foot in the state of Ohio? There's like 14,000 people in Ohio have raccoons as pets. They are absolutely, I mean, they litter box train them. They teach them tricks. Yeah, you just have to constantly deworm them because Malus ascaris porcinus, it's good for raccoons, it is not good for people. So, yeah, I think we need to, I think we have this idea in conservation of preservation. We use conservation and we're trying to preserve it. And when you're trying to get it back to what it was before, you're too focused on preservation, and that's not what conservation is. Conservation is working towards the thriving of an ecosystem, whatever that looks like. And ecosystems are dynamic; they've shifted, and the reality is we can't. I mean, you could try to get North America back to pre-European settlement, but it's futile. And not only that, I think it would be wrong, and it would be. It would actually not be, it would neglect some of the rich, wonderful things that happens as humans and animals interact in urban areas.
Yeah.
You don't want to reintroduce elephants into North America or anything
Oh,
like
I
that?
would, yeah, but where there aren't a lot of people.
There you go.
Yeah, mastodon and mammoths too. Put
Yeah,
them
yeah.
up in like the
Yeah.
tundra of Alaska or the Yukon.
That would be fun. One answer to the question, I think that the redemption is going to be cosmic in scope. So, the whole creation is groaning, the cosmos is groaning for redemption. So I think when new creation comes, it's everywhere. And this, I teach environmental ethics, and we talk about, that's the core of environmental ethics, is what ecosystem is best. Is it this ecosystem, or is the ecosystem 10 years ago? Or is the ecosystem 500 years ago? How do you judge which ecosystem is best? And so the talk this morning about beauty is basically me trying to create an environmental ethic with a clear objective standard of best. Because if you don't have any standard, why is one ecosystem better than the other? And so what I'm suggesting is that we use beauty as a standard for goodness. So an ecosystem is better than another one if it's more diverse and more harmonious. And that's going to look different. Specific details are complicated and work out differently. But those are kind of, in my opinion, the standards that we're looking for. So a fox is in a city that's diverse and harmonious, that's better than a fox in a forest if the harmony isn't there.
Quick question for you guys. Let's say we've got people out here who aren't scientists but are really interested in creation science. What would you just recommend for them in terms of, what should they engage with? What, how do they stay in touch with these kinds of things, especially the research side of it? Got any ideas there?
I would say the Creation Biology Society. It's a group of scientists. We've all presented and attend. And it's an annual meeting. You're welcome to attend, but also we publish abstracts that can be read. There's a really well curated blog called New Creation blog, and I think that's the best resource online that I think exists for young Earth creationism. So New Creation blog.
Yeah, that's right.
It's good. The good lay level articles that written oftentimes by scientists or by people who've really studied it well, really well done. So I think that's what I would point to.
Yeah, I might add in there the Creation Biology Society meeting. It's also a meeting of the Creation Geology Society and the Creation Theology Society. It just got started up. And there are some former faculty even here that are involved with the Creation Theology Society. So it's a really good meeting if you're able to go to that.
Yeah.
Do you have anything, Matt?
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Okay. He's got his stamp on there too. So, okay.
Actually, I will say Todd Wood and Paul Garner have a podcast. If you guys like podcasts, it's called Let's Talk Creation, and it's good. So Todd Wood and Paul Garner are two of my favorite people. And they're two of my favorite young Earth creationists. So anytime you get to read or listen to what they say, you should take that opportunity.
Okay. Any last questions before we close things up? See, I put in last there, and now you're like, oh, that question wasn't that important. Okay. Let me end with this. Oh.
2 hands that went up.
Oh, that's a question for me. We'll get there. Was there another question that was related to parasites or bugs or anything like that? Over here? Yeah.
Seems like we've covered this already. Any speculation, the bot fly, any speculation on what it would have been before it became horrid?
That's a great question. So my expertise is actually in a closely related group of flies. And so in this larger group of flies, parasitism has evolved independently probably 17 different times. And this group includes almost 20,000 species of flies. So it's a huge group, maybe multiple Brahmins, but a speculative hypothesis at this point is probably that they evolve from or emerge from saprophagus eaters. So a lot of these flies lay eggs in decaying plant matter, and then the larvae eat that. But there's lots of other insects that do that same thing. So it's again, it's easy to kind of imagine the fly larva, thinking, this other larva is a nice pocket of nutrients instead of this decaying plant matter, and then eventually the females start choosing those caterpillars and other stuff in the decaying plant matter, and then so on and so forth. So the origin of these seem to be saprophagus, so decaying plant matter.
Any genetic evidence for that?
This is based on phylogenetics, so not directly relating the genes to the function, but based on basically the family tree of the whole group. The ancestral state seems to be saprophagus, and then parasitism evolves again and again and again and again.
Okay. Before I answer the other question there, if people want to stay in touch with you guys, want to see what you're up to, is there any good way to kind of follow that besides Creation Biology Society? I mean, do you have like a...
I have a lab website, jeremybloschke.com, and it's mostly for scientific research. I don't do a lot of creationist stuff publicly on there, but I do some. And you can email me. I'm open to answer to discussions and talking, especially students, not just students, but I think my role in life is to help mentor students. So yeah, if you're a student interested in grad school or creationism, reach out.
I've been trying to figure out for the last 3 years since I went back to teaching at the high school level, of try to get a regular research schedule going, and I haven't been able to figure it out.
No
yet.
such thing as a regular
Yeah.
schedule.
Yep. So.
Okay, so the question was asked, what are we doing next year? And the answer is, we don't know. But actually, this is the first time this has happened, I think, since I've been here, that we didn't have a plan for next time. I sat down with Joe Francis, and we said, what are we going to do next time? And neither of us had any clue what we want to do. So if you have suggestions for what you would like to see us cover, or particular people you'd like to have us bring out here, please come and talk to me. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm just saying I'm definitely looking for that. We've got a few ideas we're kind of throwing around, but there's nothing that's a for sure. There will be one, okay, and I can't promise it'll be good. I can promise it'll be good.
It'll be good.
I'm just going to say it's going to be good, okay? But yeah, we're definitely open to hearing about that. So like I said, if you have any ideas at all, I would love to hear them. And I've got my little book, and I'll write them down, and I'll cross them off when I get home. No, I'm just kidding. We'll definitely think about it. But hey, let me pray for us, just to wrap everything up. And once again, take some time to just say thank you to our speakers. You can have safe drive home and everything. So let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and for this wonderful time we've had together. Thank you that you have created people with a desire to understand your creation and then to make that known to us. Lord, you have shown your glory in the creation, and it's great that you have put it on people's hearts to go out there and understand that and then reveal that glory to the rest of us. And I pray that you would bless them and their desire to honor you with their research. Thank you for everyone who's here. I pray this was an encouragement for everyone and provoked a lot of thoughts and questions and give us things to think on later, Lord. And I'm just so pleased to see how much your name was proclaimed as great today. And your works were shown to be wonderful and amazing and awe-inspiring. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would help us to continue to do that and to praise you every day. And as in your name, pray. Amen.